Hello everyone. Welcome to the first of two workshops concerning more than human collaborations in geographical research. I'm Johnny Turnbull and I'm a PhD candidate at the Geography Department at Cambridge, and I'm a co-organiser of this event along with Lauren Van Patter and Jenny Dodsworth. I hope everyone's doing okay given the current circumstances, but nonetheless it's great to see so many of you here virtually today. We've been anticipating this event now for over a year, having been forced for obvious reasons to rearrange the original in-person event that was due to take place in Cambridge in March last year. It's a shame we can't all meet in person, especially because we had a wonderful banquet arranged for everyone, but we're very excited for the lineup of speakers we have here today and next week, and hope that we can get together at some point in the future instead. The ideas of this workshop emerged at the AAG back in 2019 in Washington, DC, where we all came together for the first time. At the time, I was thinking about my own yet-to-be conducted fieldwork, which is based in the Chernobyl exclusion zone in Ukraine. There, I'm interested in probing questions regarding nature's apparent resurgence and the human-animal relations that have emerged in this so-called post-apocalyptic landscape. I've been primarily concerned with dogs and wolves, and I was very keen to ask what it meant for these animals to be considered as collaborators in the research process, whether this be as GPS collar wearers in the case of wolves, or in the case of dogs, and more ambitiously, as GoPro wearers that could give a sense of what Chernobyl looks like from a dog's level. I've also been probing some of my interlocutors who GPS track a range of animals as to whether they consider their subjects as collaborators and how this reorientation might affect their research process. So having discussed these themes and overlaps with Jenny and Lauren at the AAG, whose work with sheep and coyotes concerns similar technologies and ideas, we were convinced that the lens of collaboration allowed us to ask new questions and reorient our research beyond ideas of inclusion or participation, which there has already been plenty of fascinating work on. So this workshop then is intended as a space to share some emerging ideas around the motives, methods, promises, and pitfalls of more than human collaborations, and what this might mean for a range of different people and species. So I'm going to hand over now to Lauren, who will go into some more detail on the themes of the workshop, and then to Jenny, who's going to go over today's running order. So thanks again to everyone and the Vital Geographies Research Group for hosting this, and I'm really excited for the conversations that are going to emerge today.
Great, thank you so much, Johnny, and welcome everyone. So I'm Lauren Van Patter. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of Geography and Planning at Queen's University in Canada. And I want to acknowledge that today I'm coming to you from Guelph, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Anishinaabe peoples. And so I both want to acknowledge the land and its rich Indigenous histories. And I also wanted to acknowledge sort of from the outset that a lot of thinking around the more than human and post-human scholarship generally is indebted to Indigenous thought and ways of knowing in a manner that often goes unacknowledged. So I think that this is maybe an important thread that might come up in questions or discussions later today or next week. So as Johnny said, the three of us have been dialoguing and writing around this topic for several years now and are really excited to be here with all of you today and share some ideas. So within my own work, my doctoral research has explored urban coyotes in Canadian cities using a range of methods from trail cameras to GPS collar data sets and firsthand multi-species ethnographic observations. So for me, I was initially interested in questions of ethics in multi-species research and what it might mean to engage with coyotes and other animals respectfully as research participants. But in particular, through an intense experience of working with one coyote family over the course of a month, who had become embroiled in conflict within a suburban neighborhood, I began thinking about the knowledge and strategies for coexistence that we were generating together as collaborative, and what some of the opportunities and limitations of that sort of lens might be. So in addition to these more empirical conversations we've had, theoretically, we've been interested in how more than human collaborations forefront ways of generating knowledge and practices with and for non-humans rather than merely about them. So in a forthcoming paper, just really briefly, we write about the potentials of more than human collaborations for rethinking Anthropocene dialogues. And beyond participation, we're interested in the practical and speculative ways in which human and non-human others might collaborate in joint knowledge and world-making efforts, and the value of this for unsettling dominant visions of the Anthropocene. In particular, we delineate 3 propositions about more than human collaborations. The first is collaboration as storying. So the ways in which our knowledge and identities emerge and are transformed through processes and practices of storying with and alongside non-humans. So this more than human storying, collaborative storying, involves being aware of and sensitive to the ways in which our worlds become together from the outset, and the ways that the stories we tell are both worldly themselves and world building. The second is collaboration as resistance, both against forms of anthropocentric colonial capitalist violence, as well as epistemic resistance against modes of understanding that position humans as the sole authors of knowledge and planetary trajectories. And the third is collaboration as an ontological, epistemological, and ethico-political orientation. So as a way of thinking, doing, being that is interdisciplinary, future and action-oriented, and permits recognition of shared precarity and actions of solidarity within heterogeneous associations. So overall, we argue that more than human collaborations offer fruitful avenues for thinking through the specific practices, methods, and actions that might be taken in pursuit of making kin and creatively producing knowledge that is of and for our multi-species world. And so that's some of the thinking that we've been doing around this topic in the last couple of years. And we're really excited for this opportunity to foster further dialogue around this theme, and hope that the conversation can continue beyond next week, and there might be some future opportunity for further collaborations around this topic down the road. So I'll hand things over now to Jenny Dodsworth.
Thanks, Lauren. So hi everyone, I'm Jenny. I'm a PhD student in geography at the University of Oxford. I'm just going to start by outlining the structure of the workshop today. So we have the workshop structured around presentations from three panelists currently exploring ideas of collaboration in ways which contribute to the session themes. We'll hear the presentations from all 3 panelists first before opening the floor for discussion. Given the number of participants attending today's session, we've made a mural, which is an online interactive whiteboard in which you can outline questions and comments for the panelists or contribute to the wider discussion. We hope that this will give everyone an opportunity to express their views and also provide a generative visual aid for the discussion. And also we just did want to remind you that today's call is being recorded, just for those who couldn't attend today and might want to see it at a later point. My own interest in more than human collaborations has stemmed from a long existing interest in participatory techniques as they're utilised in rural landscapes. So as part of my PhD research, I've been looking at the ways that farming communities and their sheep can have their perspectives of landscapes brought to the attention of the broader public through visual social media. And I began thinking about more than human collaborations as an attempt at an emerging multi-species photo voicing. And I've so far spent several weeks in the Lake District National Park with a Herdwick sheep who had a high quality camera attached to her back as a means to try and document the lived reality of these animals who, for better or worse, spend their entire lives in some of the UK's most revered landscapes. I'm now just going to briefly introduce you to the mural platform, where we do encourage you to sort of post your questions and comments during the discussion. I'll shortly also add the link to the Zoom chat for everyone. It's best opened once you do get the link in Google Chrome or Firefox, if you have these, just because it can be a little stilted in Internet Explorer. But this is an experiment for us as well as for you all. So if you do have any trouble with it, do let us know. I'll try and be a sort of tech aid today. So I'll briefly just share my screen with you all. So I hope you can all see now the mural platform. So this is an online, live, almost like a Google Doc living sheet. And that we have instructions down the side for how you can use this mural and some top tips there for how to simply just create a sticky note. There's this outline on the side, so you can zoom right into panel 1, which is obviously today's first panel. You can use your mouse to either zoom in and out, or your trackpad if you're on a laptop. Once you're in the right place on the mural, all you need to do is double click and this will create a sticky note. You can zoom in again and write a few lines. if you do find that someone has already written a comment which you agree with or you're really keen to hear more discussion about, we've placed these stars at the bottom so you can kind of upvote an existing comment there by just dragging that star close to an existing comment so that we know that's of interest to multiple people. I do hope this makes sense to everyone, and I'll send the link over to you all now. Oops, you can see this is definitely a experiment for us, but we hope you'll enjoy using this and that it will bring some sort of fruitful discussion for everyone. I'm going to hand back to Johnny now, who's going to introduce the first panel.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I hope everyone can make sense of this technology. It should be useful. The first panel then is on the modes and motives for collaboration. Our speakers in this panel are Professor Anindya Sinha from the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore in India, Dr. Christine Ampamuza from the Kabale University in Kabale, Uganda, and Anna Lawrence from the University of Cambridge. I'd just like to check to see if Christine is here today because I know she had some trouble with internet access in the field. It looks like she might not be. So what we'll do in that case is just extend the discussion and possibly the break as well. So the first speaker then is Rana, Professor Anindya Sinha, who's up first. And I invite you to share the screen and welcome. You're muted there, Rana.
Yup. Is the screen visible? Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Johnny, Jenny, and Lauren for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here. And I can tell you I'm filled with trepidation because, you know, I'm such a new entrant into this field, but thank you for your kindness. And I hope we will have more discussions. Let me begin with a story. Raghavendra, an elderly banana seller, offers his fruits to visiting tourists at the Bandipur forest camp, largely to benefit the macaques, who eagerly wait, arms outstretched, for the bananas to be thrown to them by their laughing benefactors. It is also not uncommon for some daring individual macaques to try and grab a banana or two under the watchful eyes of Raghavendra, only to be deterred when he half-heartedly waves a long, stout stick at them. Not once, however, has he struck anyone. Small, a dominant adult male in Camp 2, a troop that I have been with for almost 25 years now, comes quietly and sits next to the banana vendor, almost in contact, but not even once looking at him or at the coveted bananas. No vocal or gestural signal is exchanged. Raghavendra picks up a banana and offers it to Small, but does not look at him. Small takes the banana gently and moves away, once again not acknowledging this donation through any visual or haptic gesture. He returns to Raghavendra a few hours later, and this mutually accepted interaction occurs again and again until evening descends softly on the forest camp. Non-human life has traditionally existed rather peacefully with human communities across the Indian subcontinent for centuries. The two primary reasons underlying the development of this harmonious relationship have been the spirituality that is believed to be shared between human and non-human beings, and the exalted positions many life forms have held in the religious beliefs of different Indian communities. Interspecies behavioral exchanges, such as that between Raghavendra and Small, can often lead to the development of intensely personal relationships between individual macaques and humans, the generation of more than human affective and immersive environments, but also in turn to the slow but steady synerbization of macaque worlds. My colleagues and I have extensively tracked individual bonnet macaques that have now begun to move out of their natural forested habitats to dwell permanently in close proximity to humans, setting into motion processes of gradual habituation, and the development of affective relationships marked by both tolerance and friction between individuals of both species. I would therefore, in today's brief discussion, like to draw your attention not only to the urban macaques that have lived with us in our Indian cities for at least 2000 years, but also to the processes of synerbization through which we come into contact with macaques, interact with them, and what is most crucial, change their lives forever. But then they change us and our lives forever as well. A troop of rhesus macaques descends from the high rises of Connaught Place in central Delhi. Sliding down pipes, their adept movement becomes a series of silhouettes over shops selling sacred threads and bangles before turning into an undulation as the simians clamber over electric wires, casting shadows on astrologers and palmists reading the fortunes of people 20 feet below. This vertical descent comes to a slow halt as the animals reach the tiled plaza in front of Delhi's iconic Hanuman temple, thronging with an evening crowd that has come to offer prayers and alms to the needy. With a sure extension of its forearm, a macaque reaches out for a banana offered by Anuj, a devotee. A transaction and a trans-species action takes place. Food for the simian and the harnessing of punya, a diffuse cleansing merit for the man. I come here every Tuesday to feed monkeys, Anuj remarks, repeating the action until his dozen bananas are gone. From a lower middle class rural family in northern India, Anuj had come to Delhi over a decade ago in search of employment, but none of his appointments ever worked out. He was exploited in many of them. Unemployed, alone in the city, Anuj's condition deteriorated, and he began to lose hope, wishing to end his life. Many times I thought I wanted to stab myself, he recounts. I became skeptical, even angry with God for my predicament. Out of sheer desperation, Anuj enrolled into IT classes and began fasting every Tuesday when he could visit Connaught Place's Hanuman temple to participate in the rituals and feed the macaques. This routine and interaction with the monkeys made me experience a deep transformation, Anuj says. His mental health gradually improved, and he even managed to secure a position in a multinational company. All credit goes to them, remarks Anuj, as he hands out the last fruit to an outstretched hand. These visits to the Hanuman temple have renewed my faith in life. Our studies for almost 3 decades now on rhesus macaques in northern India and on bonnet macaques, endemic to peninsular India, have allowed us to understand these processes of gradual urbanization of entire non-human primate populations and the governance challenges they pose across the entire Indian subcontinent, not only in its cities, but also in its forests. The macaques represent arguably the most adaptable and evolutionarily successful of all non-human primates. And given the inherent tendency of certain species to steadily but surely gravitate towards human habitations, we can only imagine how difficult the coexistence of these species with humans would be in the future. But live with them we must, for they have come to stay. Finally, let me turn to the unique ways in which other than humans, macaques here, might themselves generate particular sets of encounters with humans on their own terms. A most unexpected change in macaque-human relationship that has occurred in Bandipur in the aftermath of the socioecological nature-nurture transformations brought about by the provisioning of the forest macaques by tourists is that several individuals, mostly juveniles, in the Camp 2 troop have begun to directly communicate with their human benefactors who offer them food. This has taken the form of a novel, effectual food requesting behavior directed towards food-bearing tourists visiting the sanctuary, and which usually successfully results in food being thrown at the macaque.
No. No. begin. Begin. No.
What makes this communication, which I hope you could get a glimpse of, which has never ever been reported in wild monkeys anywhere in the world, what makes this unique is that it is invariably directed towards another primate species, humans, and never towards any conspecific individual. It is multimodal in nature and typically includes a newly evolved gesture of raising an arm towards the human, a soft coo call, "Ooh," rarely used otherwise, and a visually mediated orientating behavior that allows the macaque to lock gaze with the human benefactor while the individual continuously monitors the response of the human. All of this performed intentionally and with the hand extension gesture, even possibly referentially. These affective interactions thus emerge within a specific location, a natural cultural contact zone where humans and non-humans encounter and relate to one another through specific exchanges of signals and materials. The gradually synerbizing forests of Bandipur thus become a fertile and heterogeneous space where relationships between two phylogenetically related species are improvised and effectively ritualized within very unequal relations of power. We also visualize that the affectivity of the individual actors engaged in this relational practice leads to the co-creation of new forms of subjectivity within these changing spaces of interaction, a feature that we will possibly encounter with other non-humans too in the Anthropocene. The traditionally intimate and persistent presence of non-human primates and other species in our lives over centuries must lead to the reimagination of our societies as not being exclusively human spaces, but nature-society hybrids, co-constituted through relations between people and animals. There has nevertheless been very little engagement with the growing synerbization of our wildlife populations, whereby various urbanizing influences, primarily human activities, have forced individual animals to adapt to these altered socioecologies for their very survival. How then do other sentient creatures negotiate and learn to inhabit complex dynamic environments, comprehending them according to their own knowledges, speeds, and rhythms? What bearings do our lives and our often unfeeling actions have on the life worlds of animals? And how can a comprehension of these shared life worlds contribute to a recasting of our own perspectives, prejudices, and practices? Then, does that fervent appeal for food with arms outstretched embody the macaque's desperate, effectual bid to cope with the loss of their habitats and resources to a far more powerful species? A final act of negotiation with a world quietly slipping away from their grasp? It is time for Raghavendra, the banana seller, to pack up and wheel his cycle from Bandipur to his sparse home in the neighboring village of Melkamanahalli. Small, dusty and tired, walks slowly along the road in the opposite direction to retire to his usual dwelling for the night, that old gulmohar tree, now shorn of half its branches by workers who are keen to widen the highway through the gradually retreating forests. There is still enough tree left, however, to protect the macaques from leopards, overhanging as it does the shallow Bandipur lake, drying in the fading light of yet another summer dusk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rana. That was brilliant. Fantastic stories and perspectives there. I think we've got about 5 minutes or so for some questions now. If anyone has any for Rana. I'm looking at the mural here and I can see two, but the one's from me and one's from Lawrence. So, and now I can see like 10 mice all over the screen with different people. So I think Jenny's going to keep an eye on that, but if anyone has any that they'd like to ask right away in the chat, then perhaps.
I'm sorry, I can't see the mural possibly because of my internet, but if you could read out the questions, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, will do. So I suppose I'll kick off with the one that Lauren wrote. Lauren, would you like to elaborate on this one, or do you want me to read it for you?
Yeah, sure. I'll ask. Thank you so much, Rana. That was a wonderful presentation, and I'm such a fan of your work and your writing with Mon on ethogeographies and synergization. I just think it's amazing. And so one thing that struck me in listening to your presentation today and thinking about collaboration as a lens, you know, when you were discussing synergization, you were talking about this tension between tolerance and friction, and at the end between, you know, is it new opportunities for co-emergent life, or is it just a desperate coping with the loss of habitat? And so it makes me think, you know, is collaboration at times too sunny or too optimistic an outlook, or do you think it has the potential to cope with that sort of tension?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lauren, for that. You know, the philosophy of which I have always approached my work is that of the individual. So though I speak of urbanization of populations, ultimately it's the individual that matters. And I can tell you that through my interviews with Raghavendra or with Anuj, their lives have changed forever, right? And I do know that they recognize that perhaps even their feeding of the monkeys may not necessarily be good for them. And perhaps in another discussion, I can tell you about the repercussions at the social and at the individual level of being fed and provisioned. But who decides what is the right action? If the quality of Raghavendra's and Anuj's life improves, and temporarily that of small improves as well because of the food they get, I really don't know whether we can look beyond to say that 10 years hence, they will do really badly. So I am an innocent bystander. I try not to judge, but I do see how the quality of life of both individuals in this partnership, in this collaboration actually improves. I don't know whether that's the answer that you were looking for, Lauren, but I do think that, yes, it's here and now that I think we think about much of the time, and the inevitable will happen.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much.
We have a comment here that says the evolving, communicating. Oh, they're actually still typing, so I'm gonna let them finish. Perhaps we can go to see if anyone else has any questions in the Zoom call. Otherwise, I've got another question queued up here. Okay, so Rana, I was wondering, do you have any examples of human-macaque collaborations in the pursuit of urban design against, for instance, processes of gentrification or certain forms of urban planning and stuff like this? Do you have any direct instances of where that has occurred, rather than these kind of visions of removing macaques from the city?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I have seen anything of that kind, Johnny, but I can tell you one thing, that for those who live very close to the macaques, these are communities within the city, many of them socioeconomically challenged. Are those who never encounter a macaque, right? They are in these gated communities with security who drive them off. And so they do not really indulge in any kind of interaction with the macaques, but those who live in the informal settlements do. And so whether they feed them or whether they don't feed them, but just, you know, point them out to their children, it's a case of where there is fierce protection of the macaques by this community, where even the threat of removing macaques is protested against. And I've seen this even more strongly with dogs, but it works for macaques as well. And so I think it would really depend on, again, as I said, the kind of individuals we're talking about, perhaps some of the communities we talk about who have shared their lives perhaps over centuries with other species. And I think what works is the fact that philosophically, most of the Indian classical thinking has looked at these species in a continuum, right? Rather than us and them. And I think that really helps in some sense. Maybe these are not very concrete examples that I could give you, but I can tell you what could drive any such example if one sees it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's nice. I like this idea of the continuum. Yeah. So if there's no further questions for Rana, I think I can read out this comment, which picks up on what you were saying about dogs there, in that the evolving communicating behavior of the macaque is reminiscent of the evolution of dogs' behavioral evolution, which has led to human-canine collaborations. I wonder if macaques might become part of human society and acquire social roles similarly to what has happened with dogs.
Yes,
that's a nice comment.
If I could just add one line here, I don't know whether you know of this, Johnny, but there is this bartering system that has now been studied. For example, in Indonesia, in a particular temple on Bali, macaques have learned how to take away the belongings of the visitors or the pilgrims, and they return them only when food is offered to them. And this is the work of a very close friend and collaborator of mine. What he finds, Jean-Baptiste, and what he finds is that depending on the value of the food, they will return a particular object that they have taken. So they, particularly if they take mobile phones or glasses, which they know are precious for the individual who's lost them, they will demand only certain kinds of food without which they will not return them. We have not done a formal study of this in other macaque species, but I can tell you that in northern India, in some of the temple towns of Hardwar and Varanasi, you do have macaques, rhesus macaques, who also similarly take away objects and enter into negotiation with people. So clearly, there are certain rules of negotiation. Whether it applies to the social as well, we will know if we do some more detailed studies. But I think that question is important because it opens up a whole world of how they integrate socially with our society as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. More than human theft is a form of collaboration. Okay, so thank you very much, Rana. That was fantastic. We're going to move on now to Anna Lawrence, who is our second participant in this panel. Anna's from the University of Cambridge. So if you would like to share your screen, and welcome.
There we go. Can you hear me? Is that all okay? I can see it. Perfect. Fab. Hi, I'm Anna. And my work is on 19th century floriculture. So I try and think about these kind of challenges of how to reconsider plants as more sort of active research participants in my own work, in the context of archival context, which I won't particularly talk about today, which poses its own challenges, obviously. But when I sort of try to think about plants as potential collaborators, I find it useful to take it back to a sort of basic consideration of plant agency and why people started sort of talking more recently about plant agency in academic contexts. So how do I go forward? There we go. So I'm sort of loosely grouping these motivations for considering plant agency more deeply into three main areas. So firstly, sort of broadly, the expansion of the more than human, the interest in more than humans stemming from interest in animals and then expanding out to other plants and other non-human beings. And then secondly, in more specifically in the context of critical plant studies and plants especially, is this science of plant intelligence or plant neurobiology. So here I'm thinking of the work of scientists like Monica Galliano, Anthony Travavas and Stefano Mancuso and others, who are all trying to explore plants as capable of learning, of memory, of communication, coordinated response, and all these things which typically people didn't sort of attribute to plants. And I'm sort of bundling together here as well the associated philosophical imperatives and disruptions that come with these kind of advances in our understanding of plant science. And so sort of how in our Western epistemologies do we then reconsider how plants are sort of active agents within this context. And then importantly, the third sort of thread that I'm drawing in is this greater appreciation of indigenous ontologies and non-Western cultures that speak of plants and other non-human beings in more lively ways. And it's these final two sort of groups which I think are most important in our understandings of plant agency. And they can be seen to mutually support each other to some extent. So notably in the work of Potawatomi author Robin Wall-Kimmerer in Braiding Sweetgrass, and also the work of Mary Cissy Genius. They talk about how these two different languages can converge when truly listening to plants. So it's entirely possible to hold them together. But I think it's important to reflect on what do these sort of different lines of inquiry mean for thinking about plants as collaborators, because they aren't always sort of held together so easily. And so what does it mean when our working definitions of plant agency are so tied up with the science of plant intelligence, proving to us that plants are in fact more sort of alive in ways which are more legible to humans in terms of sentience or memory or intentionality. And then in thinking about working with and thinking with indigenous ontologies, it's also important to recognise that these emerge from close relations with specific places. So I don't know if anyone saw, there was an excellent thread on Twitter the other day by Dr. Zoe Todd on Braiding Sweetgrass, and especially its popularity with white audiences. And Todd warns that we need to sort of be wary of these popular pan-indigenous discourses, which can encourage extractive practices of poaching certain ideas about plant-human relations and displacing them into other alien contexts, geographically removed from their original place. So we need to be very aware of trying to understand this sort of onto-epistemology of thought created in and with place and fundamentally rooted within specific geographical contexts when we are thinking with and using various different indigenous ontologies to reconsider plant agency. And so there's a challenge here in sort of how to retain the political import or potential of plant thinking without either a over-romanticization of pan-indigenous discourse, or on the other hand, an over-reliance on the explanatory power of Western science and the science of plant intelligence. So in thinking a little bit more about this idea that the terms of plant agency are often closely connected to concepts of intelligence that are made legible to humans, I want to think a bit more about what types of agency are typically most recognizable in plants. And in plants, as in animals, there are certain hierarchies in terms of which plants are easiest to think with. So active plants, I'm sort of defining here as disruptive plants. So invasive plants or weeds, or even psychoactive plants, which are sort of more charismatic in those terms. And these are plants which simultaneously have the greatest capacity to disrupt human life and human control of plants. And they're also the types of plants which have certain elements of active agency most sort of recognizable in reference to the human. So they're fundamentally mobile, they're quite fast moving, more in sync with human temporalities, and they have a strong presence or drama about them. So for want of a better term, sort of main character energy, which plants typically lack when they are backgrounded as environment, as the background to the drama of animals and of humans. And I'm not necessarily saying that this is a bad thing, that we sort of turn to these types of plants, especially when we're trying to explain how plants might have agency in general. It can be a useful tool to think with, and it's logical why we do that. But I think it's worth paying attention to and considering why it is easier for us to talk about these plants in agential terms when we have supposedly theoretically unchained the term agency from its human reference. And so in considering plants as collaborators, the question of how active the plants are inevitably comes to mind. because collaboration, to me anyway, implies a certain level of active participation on the part of the collaborators. And so there are significant methodological challenges posed in accessing the more subtle and distinctive aspects of plant agency. So Head, Atchison and Phillips in 2014 write about this and consider, for example, photosynthesizing at a very basic level, and these types of plant agency which shouldn't be ignored in favour of the more active or familiar forms. So we need to step back and reconsider agency more thoroughly and collaboration from the plant's perspective. And I mean, in thinking about plants as collaborators or co-producers of knowledge and research, it's often harder to see than perhaps with animals how they might be active in these relationships. They often end up sort of enrolled in very overtly human projects and reliant on very high levels of human ventriloquism. And collaboration makes me think of participatory action research. And Hannah Pitt here writes about how to try and place plants within this kind of framework and the challenges of this. And thinking about the benefits of this type of research, of participatory action research, it's sort of meant to be more democratic, right? It's meant to be co-designed with outcomes mutually determined by the different participants. And there's always meant to come back to that question of who is this research for? And of course, when you bring plants into this, it's quite hard to see ways in which plants might actively determine the sorts of outcomes that are sought. And the sorts of outcomes that might end up occurring. And it arguably could benefit certain plants in terms of, I don't know, conservation or gardening and care. But there's a sort of complex need here to look at these outcomes from the plant's perspective, which is hard to do. And we need to be honest and pragmatic about the inevitable power imbalances at play. And depending on your perspective, these benefits would also need to be literally rooted in place if it's of benefit to literal material plants. And so this demands quite site-specific research, which of course isn't always appropriate to every type of research into plant-human relations. I'm thinking about my own work here, especially in archival contexts. And many of these questions about plants and humans come down to the sort of core question of how to deal with the plant as a non-human other. Do we, on the one hand, emphasize the similarities and continuities between beings, between plants and humans and animals, or do we emphasize their differences and the plant as a sort of other? Or following Val Plumwood, do we try and maintain a healthy balance between the two, ideally? And I'm sort of inelegantly boiling this down to two different stances here of Matt Hall's advancing of plants as kin, drawing heavily on indigenous ontologies, and then Michael Marder's argument, on the other hand, that plants represent the limits to a human ethics of empathy due to their fundamentally alien otherness. And so I think collaboration with plants really depends on your theoretical framing of plant-human relations and which of these sorts of perspectives or what collection of different perspectives you might actually buy into when you're framing this type of research. And one of the major issues here in critical plant studies is that of language, that we're fundamentally limited in our understanding of plant being and plant behaviour because of the inevitable human and animalistic reference points our terms are tied to. So intelligence, communication, sensing, etc. We don't necessarily have the words to convey specifically plant-like behaviour, and therefore when discussing plants, we sort of result in a type of purposeful ignorance. So when thinking about plants and their agency, I think it's really important that we define certain terms very clearly and very carefully and how we're using them. Firstly, in acknowledging and accepting their relation to the human, but then in sort of twisting and playing with them, with their multiple meanings to imagine alternative forms of being and relation. So thinking about, for example, plants as persons or beings in their own right, you know, asking the plant, who are you, rather than what are you, and that sort of thing. And so there's an ethics here in attending to the power of our language, of what kinds of relations we are actually representing in our writing and our speaking, and if we're actually doing justice to those beings that we are representing, if representing is even the right word in that context. And I think I prefer co-production, possibly, to collaboration when it comes to plants, as it seems that there's more of an acknowledgement that the work is my own, but my knowledge and my being is fundamentally co-constituted or co-produced with plants. And so just to wrap up here, in thinking of, in terms of the motivations for collaboration with plants, is often framed in explicitly environmentalist standpoints. So understanding plants as cornerstones of ecology, which have typically been underrepresented and under-recognised in our thought, and whose flourishing is sort of critical for climate change and ecological destruction, for managing these problems. And thinking with plants is also useful in our more than human thinking in general, in pushing us further away from the human than many animals will allow, and challenging us to go more down the lines of an ethics of intrinsic value. And this all requires sort of careful attunements and a sensibility of learning through observation, of slow learning, away from the acted dramas of animal lives. So again, Hannah Pitt here talks about plant research as apprenticeship, emphasising this slow unfurling of learning over time and close relation. And we're sort of constantly invited to creatively experiment in our relations, methods and writings about plants and other non-humans in general. So in context of gardening or art or dance, even creative writing. But we can't invite this type of experimentation without being open to failure. So I just want to sort of end by emphasising that I think this requires an ethics of openness, of honesty about our aims and intentions, about our power and the imbalances of power, and honesty about failure and when our plans of how to try and engage more experimentally with plants and other non-humans fails. And so we need to try and avoid romanticising the potential transformations that this type of work could invite, and instead treat it more as a sort of opportunity to remain open to future growth. So thank you very much. There's some references for you alongside some nice dahlias from a dahlia show in New Zealand for you to look at. I'm happy to share slides if you like. And that's that.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was fantastic again. So much to think about there, and I think it'll be interesting after having a few questions to open this up with Rana as well for a discussion, because I'm sure he's got lots to say on plant intelligence and stuff like this. So we've had a few comments on the board, on the mural. So maybe I'll kick off with one of those. If anyone who's written one of these would like to speak for themselves, that might be nice. So there's one that starts with, "Hi Anna, I know this is a big question." From Hannah.
Sure, hold on.
I'll share my screen as well, Johnny, so that everyone can see the mural and zoom in a little bit.
Sounds good.
Just to help a bit. Also, yeah,
I'll just read what I wrote. Thank you, Anna, for that's such an interesting presentation. I know you said you weren't really going to talk about this, but I'm so interested to hear more about how consider collaborations with non-human others in the archival context, and how we can find these points for collaboration in both non-human and non-living others.
Yeah, well, this is something that is very much at the front of my mind a lot of the time, and I still struggle knowing where I'm going with it. I've been, alongside my own archival work, I've been trying to cultivate a sort of Victorian flower garden at times, to try and, because I think it's just generally a good idea to sort of be materially engaged with the sorts of relationships that you're then reading about in the archive, which I found for me has helped me then to pick up more on certain things that I read in the archive and sort of recognise them as like, oh, okay, yes, that's also something that I can sort of relate to and understand that is actually quite important. And it's a risky thing in terms of archival work, how much you sort of rely on your own emotions or sort of empathy, I suppose, to relate to the archival material, because obviously there's a danger there in over-analysing or sort of placing too much of myself onto the things that I'm reading. But I think also it's a really useful way, as long as you're aware of that risk of sort of entering different understandings of how these engagements with non-humans make people feel in general. Is that enough to answer your question very briefly? It's something that I'm thinking a lot about.
Thank you. Yeah.
It seems like Phil's comment is getting some stars. Is that right? This one on kin. I wonder if Phil would like to read out this comment.
This is like being on Twitter, which I'm not. I really enjoyed it. But the question is also to Ranu in a way, and you raised it right at the end. I think it's the obvious danger of sort of romanticizing that connection with particular groups or you know, as whole communities. Long ago, I sort of wondered what on earth kith and kin meant. You know, we use that sort of expression all the time, and kin is blood. That's your sort of immediate family or your tribe or whatever it is. But kith is apparently all those kind of people, you know, who exist around you, your neighbors. You can think of them as support systems, but you know, those people that you have a connection to. I'm obviously saying they don't have to be people, but you know, you're removing that kind of, you know, slightly queasy making sort of blood element of kin, and sort of. I'm not saying you can just replace one with the other, because kithship isn't any kind of word, and you'd have to explain it all the time. But I do worry a little bit about thinking about, for instance, beings that don't even have blood as kin in that way. I'm presuming that's something that, you know, worry that you share, and same too with Rana. But you know, never sat down and discussed this with you, which is silly of me.
I think for me anyway, this comes back to, again, where you trace this thought in terms of, are you drawing more on indigenous sort of cosmologies or not? Because if you're thinking about specific indigenous cosmologies, then of course it's a completely different understanding of human and non-human ontology, in terms of we are actually all made of the same matter, and we do all descend from the same ancestors, and that's literally how those worldviews are understood. And so I agree there's a sort of risk there potentially. But then equally also, again, Matt Hall talks about this in how he explains plants as kin. And he says, well, literally, we are all descended from a common ancestor. However many billion years ago, all living things are fundamentally descended from a common ancestor. So if we're thinking of it more in terms of genealogical ancestry than sort of our contemporary similarities or relations, then I think it's a useful term to use in that respect.
Thank you.
We've got a couple more comments on here and questions. I see Bill Adams has asked a question. I wonder if you would like to read that out, Bill.
Sure, thanks. And a great thought-provoking talk. I was wondering whether plants offered any particular challenges in terms of the bounding of the individual, which at least large animals don't. In other words, where a plant, when one thinks of a plant, what is it you're thinking of? I'm thinking particularly of cloned species that clone. You can get an entire woodland of genetically identical elms, or you could for Dutch elm disease, and lots of other species like that. So I just wondered if plants offer novel challenges in terms of thinking what the plant is, which aren't there in terms of thinking what the dog is. You see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I completely agree. And it's definitely harder to, or I suppose it poses different challenges when trying to involve non-human plants in your work. I'm thinking especially of like invasive plants, and again, this idea that certain plants are sort of very active, or that you get whole groups of plants covering an area, and I suppose again that's where people attribute sort of agency to those groups of plant rather than the individual, which then transforms our understanding of agency in general. And it's kind of harder when we're talking about just individual relationships, unless that individual relationship is with a very charismatic plant in terms of a tree, for example, or a sort of particular house plant that people have very effective relationships to. And I think, again, in my own sort of context, when I'm trying to think about garden plants, I think that is a bit of a stumbling block in terms of people don't often have individual relationships necessarily with the sort of individual plants in their gardens, but it's also not the sort of group that's that important because they aren't as active perhaps as other groups of plants in terms of like a forest or a group of invasive species or something that overruns a space. And so there's definitely a strange sort of balance between the individual, the group, and the in-between that's really interesting to think through.
Yeah, if I could just come back on that, I think you're exactly right. It's interesting, and in many fields like conservation, people they move between talking about the individual and the species, and they do it without really realizing, at least to me, they're very different sorts of things. So what is good for a species may indeed involve killing the individual or discouraging it in some way. And so invasive plants are a good example of that. It's essentially, anyway, whether it's an individual that you're dealing with or the species, or as you say, the flower bed full of flowers, is fascinating to think through.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
That kind of picks up on this next comment from the mural board, which doesn't have an author, or the author hasn't identified themselves, so I can read it. It says, I find it interesting how plants might trouble the approach of working with individuals that was highlighted in the first talk. In many cases, plants appear / are collaborated with as collectives, whether it's a flower bed or a forest. And I think it's kind of interesting that, you know, with potential animal clones, I don't think we'd have as much trouble in treating them as individuals, whereas with plant clones or just plants in general, we definitely are more likely to see them as a collective. Yeah, I wonder if that makes any sense, or you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, like I think it affects our sort of ethical considerations of plants as well, because I think, you know, we're not afraid really to sort of kill off a house plant or something by mistake. You know, that's seen as a lot sort of less ethically problematic than killing an animal of any sort, really. And why is that, especially, is that, you know, that individual versus sort of killing a whole group of plants or horse. So I think, yeah, there's definitely interesting ethical considerations there.
There's a couple more here on the board. So this is me. I don't know why I was reading it there. So it seems like it's much easier to imagine plants as working for humans, and I'm thinking of James Palmer's work here on plants as co-laborers, like collaborators, and he talks about putting plants to work in vegetal labor. And I think when we imagine animals, it's much easier to think of them as working with and for them, rather than putting them to work for us. So yeah, I guess my question was around how we articulate what plants might want, especially when thinking through things like non-human labor. It's it's a very tricky question. I wondered if you have a thought on it, but obviously I don't expect any.
Yeah, I mean, I think typically the go-to answer anyway for people in the field is sort of flourishing, and that's the sort of ideal outcome for plants is flourishing. But then again, we get into this thorny area of like, well, that's not necessarily right for all plants, and plants that are moved out of their geographical location, invasive plants that are in a different location, flourishing for them would mean overtaking entire sort of ecologies. So then, is that the ideal outcome? Probably not. So where do we draw the line at if flourishing is the aim or not? And then it again just becomes sort of, well, then it's human control and it's sort of human determined where those kind of outcomes are appropriate and where it's not. Is that problematic? Maybe. Is it sort of inevitable because we are humans engaging with plant life? Fundamentally, it's sort of always going to be that dynamic, and I think we need to sort of be very open and honest about that, rather than trying to sort of pretend that we're speaking for plants and for what the plants necessarily want.
Yeah, thank you. That's this idea of flourishing is really interesting, but it's a tough one. I'm going to read two more comments out. So there's one in this chat box here from Emma Rowe, who says there's some similarities here about the regular calls of some laboratory animals and farm animals. And then there's a comment, the last unread one, I think, on the mural board, which says, what if notions of collaboration resisted the temptation of defining plants as what kind of agents they might be, whether kin or limits of empathy, and just focused on what plants do as agents? So I think that comes back to what you were discussing at the start of your talk around how we conceptualize plant agency. If you have any final comments on those, I think that might be nice before we kind of bring Rana back in for a broader discussion.
So can you just repeat, sorry, that was what plants do versus what plants are?
What if notions of collaboration resisted the temptation of defining plants as what kind of agents they might be, and just focused on what plants do as agents?
Yes, I think that's interesting, and it speaks to the sort of what are plants doing things for themselves, or are plants sort of enrolled in projects for other beings or with other beings, animals and humans alike? And so then where do we sort of draw the lines of like what kind of agency is sort of authentic to plants? Again, I think when we think about animals, we grant them more independence perhaps, or sort of individual intentionality and active participation, whereas plants tend to be more caught up in our own projections of what we want from them, or what we sort of think their meanings are in terms of cultural value or in terms of economic value. So I think it's harder to do that with plants, because then it's harder to get at that sort of authentic plant action and what the plant agent sort of does in that respect, if that makes sense. Evolving thought there.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the provoke very tricky questions, plants. So I wondered if we can bring Rana back into the conversation now, just to kind of think through in a bit more detail some of the connections between these two presentations, and again kind of thinking through the theme of the panel, which is what are the modes and motives of collaboration, whether they be really practical or kind of here where we've thought more theoretically, what are the motives for considering plants as collaborators, or the potentials for collaborating with animals in cities. So quickly, we've had one more comment from Jamie Arathun, who says plants do not seem to be anthropomorphized as much as animals, which is another good point. So yeah, I wondered if Rana had any comment here on kind of thinking through plant intelligence and its potential for
yeah. So one comment I would have is there has been now quite a bit of work, not put together in one place though, which has looked at plants as agents in terms of their interactions with one another, right? So, there is work that shows how the parental plant enhances the possibility of pollination of their own offspring rather than those of others. There has been work which has looked at how there is parent-offspring conflict over how many seeds should develop. So two very close friends of mine, Umashankar and Ganeshaya, have published a series of papers which have shown that the first developing seed tends to kill off all the other developing seeds, which is not in the interest of the mother at all, because the mother has invested so much in all the ovules that she would like them to develop as seeds. And so there is parent-offspring conflict. There are also cases of sibling rivalry, where seeds, again, developing seeds compete with one another. And it has been shown that they actually secrete a toxin which kills off the other seeds. And so if you remove the seed that is producing the toxin, the next one starts producing it, right? So clearly there are mechanisms by which can be anthropomorphized in some sense of the term, or at least even looked at in terms of how animals behave. And those have been used to push for, if not intelligence, at least behavioral strategies in plants, slightly different from those of animals. There was also a fantastic set of papers, and I forget, I can hunt them out, which showed that a certain parasite, plant parasite, which was growing, was offered a choice of different host plants with different nitrogenous content, and the roots developed completely in tune with where there was more nitrogenous content. And if you switched those plants around, the root changed course, right? So this was again modeled in terms of optimal foraging theory, which is what we've done with animals as well. So clearly, therefore, there are plants, I guess, can be looked at least in my opinion, can be looked at as agents which are competing with each other. In some cases, they cooperate with each other. We do know of phytoalexins, where the developing root of a plant kills off all the other plants in its environment. And so when you look at those, can we extend that further to look at how they interact with humans? And I think it will be fascinating to see whether we can look at mechanisms that plants have to resist human agency, in a manner of speaking, though of course it will never be as active or as evident or as crystal clear as it is for animals. So that's my take on that, I think.
Thank you very much. I wondered if we had any broader comments now or questions from the audience or anyone else on the kind of general themes that we've covered, considering modes and motives for collaboration. I think it would be interesting now to try and tease some of these things out. In the meantime, Cornelia Benson has asked a question. Would you like to ask it yourself, or are you happy with me reading that?
Yeah, I'm happy to ask it.
Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking about whether we could think about, and if so, how we can think about human, animal, and plant collaborations rather than just like humans and monkeys or humans and plants, whether we could bring that together, or at the moment whether that was sort of beyond the limits of how we can collaborate.
I mean, I think we have to, and we always kind of inevitably are, right? I mean, whenever we're talking about plants, we're also inevitably talking about insects at the very least, and about other sort of pest animals and things, depending on the context that we're talking about. So whether or not we're making it explicit in the sort of framing of our work, but I think that's actually a really good point. Like, we probably should be, I should be more, making that more explicit, that I am also talking about those connections, because it's always risky when we sort of corner off different kingdoms sort of artificially to look at. We need to also attend to those kind of the cross collaborations between them inevitably as part of that.
Yeah, if I may just add a point to Cornelia's question, we do know of certain interesting collaborations, for example, where, in Africa, where humans are taken to bee hives by honey guides. These are birds who actually lead, and there's been a series of papers on this, on how they lead humans to the beehive, simply because the humans then offer them honey, which they then collect. And so you do have these kind of collaborations. We also know of plant-animal symbiosis. So for example, again, in Africa, you have these ants which nest in the thorns of acacia and prevent giraffes from feeding on them because they secrete a very, very foul-smelling fluid, which the giraffes don't seem to like. And so they're clearly, evolutionarily, there have been transactions. There have been sort of coexistence, rules of coexistence, where they in a manner of speaking, help each other. There may even be instances where humans perhaps are involved, but I'm not sure I know of too many examples of where together plants, animals, and humans sort of collaborate with one another. But I'm sure there could be. I mean, one needs to really look at that, I think.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question concerning kind of non-human to non-human interactions, because usually this research that we do is either looking at human-plant or human-animal entanglements. I think in Alice Avoca's recent progress paper on animal geography, she talks about animal-animal interactions as opposed to just looking at human ones that center on this more than human rather than the kind of other than human. I just keep coming back in my own thought to the idea of non-human labor when I think about plants as collaborators, and just thinking through it there in terms of human, animal, plant interactions. I feel like as plants as primary producers, as the kind of the originators of free gifts of labor, if you want to think of free gifts of nature, if you want to think about it in terms of value in nature. I think this, as Anna was saying, it's something like you're never quite outside of the human plant animal interaction anyway. It's almost fundamental in a sense, and I guess this is what kind of we've been thinking through, whether collaborations is almost an ontological argument, although kind of we don't want to lose the ethics or the politics that come with it. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It just reminds me, there's a beautiful quote from Natasha Myers writing about this, that says, we are because they are, in terms of humans and plants. And I think that sort of sums it up really nicely and is an important thing, as you say, sort of ontologically to hold in mind.
Is there any more comments coming through on the mural there? Is anyone else? Have I missed any on the mural, Jenny? Oh, we've got someone typing actually.
I've got a question that I just added to the mural. It's sort of either for Anna or for Rana. Anna, you mentioned that you prefer the term co-production over collaboration, which I thought was really interesting and valuable. But so I'm wondering methodologically if either of you feel like collaboration in terms of knowledge production is too romantic a concept, or if it's useful, and what sort of potentials there might be methodologically to consider either plants or animals as either co-producing knowledges or collaborating in knowledge production. So if you might want to speak to that a little bit more.
I think for me anyway, it comes out partly from the nature of my work. I think if I was perhaps working with real plants, contemporary plants, then it might be easier to think about it more in terms of collaboration, even sort of with land and site and that sort of thing. Or even if I was working obviously with other sort of humans and understanding their relationships with plants, then it might be easier to conceptualize that in terms of collaboration. So perhaps for me that comes more out of my understanding of trying to access historical plants and feeling that there's sort of multiple barriers built up there in terms of how to think about those as collaborators. But I'm also very wary of the sort of over romanticization of the term, which yes, I sort of feel a bit uncomfortable with collaboration compared to co-production or co-constitution. But that's my own take.
If I could just add something, the example I just gave of how people learn about the environment by watching other animals. In some cases, they are willing collaborators, the animals, as in the case of the honey guides, they actually lead people on. I was, however, looking at it perhaps now slightly differently. So let us say that there is a macaque group which interacts with a community of humans, and there may be some exchange of materials and signals. When a human understands what the macaque is all about, I do also think they get insights into themselves, right? And these might be insights which could either be, in some sense, biological. I once, met a hunter. I was working in Northeast India, and I met a hunter, and he said, I kill the monkeys that you study, and he asked me, what do you study? And I said that, look, I look at their behavior. And he said, show me what you see. And I said that, look, here is a mother who's protecting her young and 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 interacting with her young in certain ways. And he looked at me and he said in Hindi, they are like us. And I said, they are indeed like us. And he said, one thing I can promise you, I won't kill any mothers anymore. So so insights into oneself by studying others, by interacting with others, even if they be of other species, would you call that collaborations? Would you call that generation of knowledge, generation of insights into what one truly is? Leave it open there.
Great. Thank you both so much. Yeah, I really appreciate both of those comments. Thanks.
So I think there's time for more comments and questions if anyone has them. But I think we're kind of coming towards a break, and also kind of coming towards the difficulty of thinking with collaboration, which is it's a provocative term that we're hoping kind of does have, like, in thinking through the motives here in this first session, we hope it kind of does some work that some related concepts like participation and inclusion aren't quite doing at the moment. So we hope these discussions have been useful. So if there's no more comments or questions right now,
can I just one comment, Johnny? Is it possible for us to have exchange email addresses so that if later, we want to talk to each other a bit, raise questions, maybe think of collaborations, we could write to each other? So are you planning to circulate the email addresses? That would be wonderful. Thanks.
Yeah, with GDPR, etc., we can't obviously just share the mail list that we have, but maybe I'll set up a Google Doc or something, and everyone who's been interested from today who would be keen to have a sort of group mail list running can add their email address.
Thanks very much.
So